Okay, hi everybody, and welcome to this week's multi-tenancy working group meeting. It's Tuesday, July 30th. Today we have a pretty packed agenda. Jim is going to present on Kyverno, and his team has been working on a feature that gives you the ability to generate configurations when a namespace is created. So he's going to talk to us about that and I guess get some feedback. He's already presented it to the policy group. And we'll talk more about the tenancy v2 CRD work. We have a call for multi-tenancy use cases that Adrian will go over. And then we have been invited by the Financial Services User Group to come and present our security profiles that we've been working on. So I would say we have both of those in what I would call a rough draft form. Very much at a design level, not an implementation level. So I would encourage people to look at those and provide feedback. And I need to incorporate some feedback we've already gotten. But we have a single user to one cluster proposed security profile, and then we have a multi-tenancy profile that is incomplete. So I'll post the GitHub links to both of those and encourage people to check them out and add what they think needs to be in there. And with that, I will hand it over to you, Jim.
All right, thank you. Okay, so let me quickly share. So also you're with me, and I'm on audio through Shooting's computer. So you're with me, Shooting Zhao, and also Shiv Dadani. You're two of the contributors on Kyverno. So like Tasha mentioned, we presented at the policy work group last week, and one of the feedback items was to check in with what the work going on multi-tenancy because of some of the features and things we were talking about. So just quick introduction, and I know there was also some questions on the message forums in terms of the relation of policies to multi-tenancy, etc. So at least we can share our kind of viewpoints on that and get some feedback. But just to start with, why policies at all, right? So of course, configuration management remains a vast and complex topic in Kubernetes, and anything we can do to make that easier for operators helps. So that was one of the main motivations for policy management and Kyverno. And I'll talk about how this compares to some of the other projects like OPA and Gatekeeper and others. And then, of course, there is a growing need as Kubernetes is looked at for multi-tenant use cases, whether it's teams within enterprises or others, to be able to enforce best practices, both community-type best practices as well as organizational best practices, right? And this could be, maybe like just auditing and seeing if everything's looking good, or it could be actually enforcing and preventing configuration which is not allowed in certain deployments. There's also use cases for updating and generating configuration, right? So both generating entire resources, or in some cases to be able to mutate resources and change things as they're being admitted into certain namespaces or certain clusters. So why Kyverno, and how does it compare to some of the other projects out there? So first off, we did not want to, invent any new language or any new, sort of come up with a new, full-fledged general purpose type of policy engine, right? So the goal here was to make it easier for Kubernetes administrators, operators, as well as users to be able to define, manage policies in Kubernetes. So that is not just authoring the policies and writing the policies, but also being able to see the results, apply them to Kubernetes resources in a very flexible manner, etc. Right? And the other thing we wanted to do from the beginning is we didn't want to, kind of have a limited set of types. We wanted one of the requirements was to be able to update, sort of the growing set of CRDs out there, of which, and even to the extent of perhaps updating, policies themselves if needed through other policies. So what Kyverno is not, and we don't, we wanted to make sure that we're not trying to sort of take this in a direction where for what it's not intended to be. So it's not a general purpose policy engine, like I mentioned, where some of the other projects like OPA are. We're not trying to introduce a new language. So the idea and the constructs are really more to introduce something like you could think of like tools like JQ or even customized to some extent, which provide some, like some value add features, but without completely requiring or having a steep learning curve for Kubernetes operators. And like I mentioned, we didn't want to be tied to a particular API or version schema. We wanted this to be schema-less from the beginning. So let's take a look at what Kyverno does and what it looks like, in action. So in terms of the high-level view, so we have a policy engine, and that takes resources from different triggers, right? And of course, the main ones being the mutating, validating webhooks. We also listen to, there's a controller which listens to namespace creation, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. But then as things flow through the policy engine, the outputs are validated resources. And these would be annotated and in terms of saying that the policy has validated or mutated those resources. There would be events that would flow out of the policy engine. So these go into resources as well as the policy CRDs. And violations, which today are a sub-resource of the policy CRD, but could be full-fledged resource. That's something we're trying to get feedback on and decide on. So really at a high level, this is how the policy engine works. But then let's take a look quickly at what a policy looks like in Kyverno, right? So the basic structure is policies consist of a set of ordered rules, and rules can select one or more resources, and each rule can either generate, mutate, or validate configuration, right? So fairly simple structure. We don't have, rules are ordered, so they are applied in order. But of course, as the webhooks sort of are also sequenced, that sequencing would apply first. So and then anything, of course, any changes of the policy engine, what we do for the generate portion is done after the resources are created. It doesn't apply through the webhooks, right? So that's handled slightly differently. But the structure, as you can see in the text and the YAML, it's fairly simple. You can select one or more. The resource block allows you to select based on types, based on wildcards, based on also namespaces. And then once you've selected, or label selectors, right? So it's a standard label selector. Once you've selected a resource to operate on, the structure of the policy depends on whether you're trying to do something like a mutate or a validate, or if you're trying to generate configurations. So for the mutate, there's two flavors. One is using a JSON patch. So somewhat difficult to write this path, but very precise in what it can do. So that's always available. And then the flavor, it seems a little bit simpler to use and maybe more popular, is using an overlay style, much like customize, right? So you're basically just declaring the intent of what you want your policy to do using YAML, and you are then able to apply that either in a mutate or a validate.
So sorry, just a quick question. Is that similar to Customize, or does it actually use Customize under the hood?
It's similar. Yeah, we are not using Customize underneath.
Okay, thanks.
Does it use strategic merge with annotations in the kinds? Or?
Yeah, so for the annotations, currently we do support the strategic merge, so it will be able to take that and based on whether something exists or not, be able to decide. And we are, again, like this is so we're trying to see like which style is more often used, and at least what we're seeing initially is it just seems more natural to use the overlay style versus writing these patches. But yeah, I guess patches perhaps are easier to generate and also manage again for certain updates.
The resource block, can you specify CRDs, or is it just?
Yes.
Oh, you can.
Yes.
Okay, great.
So it doesn't. Again, like we have no sort of the type of client we're using underneath is a dynamic client, and we haven't tied it to any fixed set of resources on purpose, of course, by design, to be able to select any CRD or even types that we're not aware of for that cluster, right? So.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, few quick, and so as much as we're trying not to create a language, of course, there's a few, kind of helper syntax, if you will, that seem to be required to do certain types of processing. So here are a couple of examples. We have something called anchors, where within this overlay, within the YAML fragment, if you specify the parentheses on the key, what that checks is basically if that key exists, so it validates, and then it will select the rest of the contents, right? So it will apply the rest of the content. There's also a slight variation on that for if not defined. So if a key doesn't exist, then you can take some logic or apply some logic. So these are just some quick examples. So this is, with the plus sign, it means if it's not defined, then you want to replace or add it. But if there is a value, then it will not be updated. Similarly, the validator is also extremely simple. With the couple of things we support here are patterns to match and select. So, for example, this is showing a wildcard pattern, just using very standard, again, sort of pattern matching regex type operators. And then if you want to do comparisons, there's operators that would apply, of course, for equals, not equals, greater than, etc. So, but fairly straightforward for somebody who's familiar with the resource constructs to write these policies. For generate, which is, like Tasha mentioned, that was one of the topics of interest. We currently support only namespace as a trigger, and the motivation for that was very similar to what's been discussed in this working group, where when a new namespace is created, to have certain standard configurations. And for one example, of course, here is a network policy, but there could be other configurations like role bindings, etc., that are created and applied. We are also, one of the comments or questions that came up in the policy work group discussion was, other than namespaces, would it be interesting to support other create triggers? And that's, of course, very possible. We just want to understand the use cases a little bit better before we add that as a feature. So just to kind of summarize what a policy looks like, so there's validate, mutate, generate. The mutate will be patches and or the overlay style with a few kind of decorations for conditional logic. And the validate also will support the same conditionals, and in addition to that, wildcards and operators. The generate can operate on inline data or can clone. Basically, you can copy from an existing namespace and existing resources. So the idea there would be you set up one namespace as a template, which is of course not accessible to tenants or to other users, but then you would use that to stamp out more namespaces. And of course, like we talked about, label selectors, wildcards, etc., are supported. So some more advanced flows, and we're kind of thinking about these, and again, would love to get feedback and thoughts on. I mean, it is possible to generate configs, and then the mutate policies would apply to them, of course, as they go through the admission controller. So would like to see if there's use cases for that, if that needs to be formalized more. Also, it is possible to generate policies for certain namespaces if that's interesting, right? And there too, again, would like to know what exactly the use cases would be. So the other discussion we had with the policy working group, which is interesting, right? So we're not, the first ones to write a policy engine, and we probably won't be the last, right? So there will be other, there's need for policies in different languages as well. So it seems like there's enough common constructs that any such policy engine would require, and would be interesting to consider, can some of this, all of the Kubernetes specific machinery and the outputs, the inputs and outputs, is there interest in sort of value in standardizing this, right? So, and then allowing policy engines to be written or plugged in as required. So that's something, again, we'll explore with other groups as well, but would like to hear feedback on that. And just quickly covering our roadmap. So we're not GA yet. We're not. We haven't reached 1.0. But one of the main features, which I think would also be of interest to some of your use cases, is supporting querying of in-cluster data, right? So existing configurations. We're also looking at performance and optimization. So we need to do some benchmarking, profiling, and tuning there. I talked about the other generate triggers. We're kind of thinking about what else can we use. And then, another interesting question is, as we're generating config, is there a need for, is it pretty much static config? Is there a need for some parameters or templating type of mechanisms to be supported, right? So that's also a question which we have, we're open to feedback and inputs there. So, and really kind of coming back to policies and multi-tenancy, right, is the interesting thing here is if you're looking, if the working group is looking for solutions to how do you get, standard configuration for namespaces, certainly CRDs can be used, templating can be used, but policies may be another good tool to leverage from the tool bag. And maybe there's, there's use cases to combine all three of these, I guess, depending on what makes life easiest for cluster operators and is able to accomplish the features and requirements. So really that's all I had in terms of the presentation. There's a lot more examples, and it's extremely simple to apply and use in your local or any cluster. So do try it out, give us the feedback, but let me stop here and see what the thoughts and feedback, and if you have any other questions.
Hey, Jim, this is Sanjeev. So yeah, this is great. Were you going to describe the comparison versus Gatekeeper and a few other projects?
About to ask that same question.
Yeah. So just to kind of recap, I touched on some of the points to the presentation, but quickly to recap, it's our use of dynamic types. So we're not kind of going for a specific set of types that we support. And Gatekeeper, as we currently, from what we saw, it's fixed in terms of the resources it supports. We're not trying to introduce a new language.
That's true. I just did a little bit of work on Gatekeeper. It can target CRDs.
Okay.
You do have to learn a new language called Rego,
Right.
which is, so like in my mind, comparing the two, the key advantage here is would be ease of use. It does look like it's easier to get started. I just had 2 interns that were working on Gatekeeper, and it is tricky to get started on Rego. It's very powerful, but if all you're trying to do is set an overlay,
Yes.
I can see that being complicated. We were able to adapt it to generic structures, though.
Okay.
So, Adrian, that's one thing is that the next phase of Gatekeeper is the librarian type functions. So you don't have to learn Rego. There will be a market of things to choose from. Yeah.
I actually just pinged one of the Googlers working on Gatekeeper. They weren't able to join this meeting, but they should be able to watch the recording and
Okay.
if they have any thoughts. Okay, thanks.
I
Yeah,
kind of wonder the same if these Kyverno, the API Kyverno speaks could be run through OPA as the engine and kind of share some of that code.
Yeah, so certainly, again, I think there's huge benefits to standardizing the inputs and outputs and sort of allowing some flexibility in terms of whether it's Rego or other languages like overlay style or even, known languages to be used to describe or to write policies. So yeah, would love to explore that further. Let me know if there are, like you mentioned, some contacts on the Gatekeeper project. Happy to reach out and explore.
One of the things I'm doing with my kind of tenants, I'm using a Helm chart per tenant essentially to stand up the resources for them. And it's more than just a role binding and a couple other things. It's an ingress controller and some other like software-y things that I stamp out. So there's kind of a templating aspect to it, but there's also a life cycle management aspect to it. So over the life cycle of a namespace, I might need to be able to upgrade the software involved for that tenant on their behalf. So using something like Helm has allowed that to be easily done. I haven't seen like a general, even just to here template this object to this other thing and then launch it. It doesn't give you the life cycle side of things. So something to consider.
Yes, that is an interesting point because everything from, of course, externally managing the users and their roles, the authorization, and then also the workload or any shared services that need to be managed for that tenant.
Yeah, there's a couple of other aspects to the life cycle as well. So, like if you're applying policy at deploy time and the policies change over time, so there's an audit function where you can sort of know that what things that have been deployed previously would now be outside of policy. And there's also from a cluster manager or even a tenant, the ability to maybe do dry runs so you can know if you're going to apply a new version of the policy or a new policy, what effect that might have offline before you actually do it.
Yep. No, great points. So we do have some mechanisms to address both of those. So for existing resources, so let's say you introduce a new policy. One thing you can do with Kyverno is you can first introduce it in just audit mode. So it will scan through the existing matching resources and report. It also reports on the mutate rules. It will report anything that doesn't match. So this way, it basically creates a set of violations that you can talk to the resource owners, etc., and try to get addressed. You can then, of course, flip it to enforce mode, but it does not impact we don't change existing running resources. But at that point, it will start blocking resources that do not match that are coming in. The other aspect of being able to try this offline, so we do have a CLI which we're working on where you can, without applying a policy, the CLI can take a cluster. It needs to talk to an API controller just through like kubeconfig or some mechanism. So it can take a cluster as an input, and then it will take a policy and then validate that and report like violations and things like that. So you can test out policies before putting them into your cluster.
Cool. So the only other question I had is the ability to do lookup. So having different tenants may have different stuff, like different the policies and particularly the generate may actually look quite different for different tenants, and being able to look that up from something else, or even just in a policy, like I'm making this up, but if you wanted to have sort of some team specific stuff, and you've got all your team information in another in a set of CRDs somewhere that you could do lookups, as to what labels and things like that.
Right. Yeah, would love to understand that, and maybe if there's a documented use case, because I think that would be very interesting for us to explore. Is like so like you mentioned, there are two possibilities, right? One is looking up data which is configured in the cluster elsewhere, or the other option is, of course, matching something in the incoming resource itself. So and we can do the latter today. We are planning on adding the feature to look up data from within the cluster. So yeah, I would love to understand that use case more in terms of, would it be some tenant information? What would be the logic? What would be the conditional sort of choice of which policy to apply? Yeah.
So in Opera, the other variation on that is that you can actually just hit it, just upload a bunch of context or whatever data just in raw JSON into the engine, and the rules can access that as well as any of the other resources on the cluster.
Yes, so we were thinking of something like that, or perhaps just using config maps, right? So could there be
sure.
Yeah, so maybe then a config map acts as the data dictionary, if you will, for the engine.
Yep, sounds good.
So one more general thought. There's a danger of coming up with a domain-specific language and then pouring more and more features into it, and growing a general language into it over time. Like you see it with like Chef and Puppet and things, where they started off with something that looks like YAML, and they eventually give up and just embed all of Ruby.
Yeah.
So something to consider there. Where is the edge of this box, and where do you tell people to go when they need something more? Right. Is that, okay, now it's time for Rego or something else, right?
Right. Yeah, totally agree with that, right? And that's something we've discussed a few times too, because there were some features where we were ourselves tempted to say, well, can we just write some JavaScript, or can we, run some other Python or some other language and for the processing part of it, right? But so far, yeah, just YAML again with a few kind of additional syntaxes seems to cover most of the use cases. But you're absolutely right, that is a concern, and that is something. We don't want to invent a new language. If we do have to support a language, one option is there like a bypass to using a standard or a well-known language out there.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for that presentation. Definitely super interesting. Yeah, if you have any code or anything you'd like us to check out, just add it to the agenda doc, and I'm sure people would be interested.
Okay, thank you.
Cool, thanks, Jim. So next up, we are going to talk about, Sanjeev's going to give an update on some of the work stream efforts that are going on, and just kind of let everyone know what we've been up to and places that we're looking for contributors on.
Yeah, this is, I don't have anything prepared. I just want to give a 2-minute update here. So really the main threads of activity that we are focusing on for, let's say, the next 3 months is, number one, having the updated version of the tenant controller CRD, which we are sometimes calling as the V2 version. The logical flow of that CRD is very similar to the prior one, but the key things are, A, it'll be implemented differently using KubeBuilder, for example. And so Faye from Alibaba has kind of started off the scaffolding for that. So he's going to kind of put some structure there, and then eventually other folks will also be able to add, contribute code or reviews and so on. So that's on the tenant controller implementation. Of course, there's continued to be design discussions. which are being captured in the tenant controller doc. So I think last time there was some discussion about changing the way the namespace templating works and so on. But the overall philosophy of the tenant controller is still pretty much what we had in the V1. But we'll have more meetings in which we'll go into more details of the tenant controller workflows. Other areas, so Adrian from Google has been initiating some activity around hierarchical namespaces. Isui had some thoughts on this in the past, but Adrian feels like he's got some simpler ideas to implement that. So we'll look forward to hearing more from that on that from him in the next couple of meetings.
Yeah, I'm just waiting for a sign off from Brian Grant and Tim Hawken before I can talk about it, the detailed design.
Sure. And then as we have the new scaffolding for the tenant controller infrastructure in place, we'll be able to then come back to, well, not just come back, but actually implement the resource controller function, because that admission control would fit in better with the KubeBuilder based tenant controller. Other areas are continuing to have a little bit more architectural analysis of the Model C based approach, where the virtual clusters based approach. So as some of you have mentioned on the Slack channel, the guys at Rancher have some project called K3V, I believe, which sounds pretty interesting. So I think Faye and others are proposing an analysis of comparing K3V with the Alibaba proposal. And so I see that one as still at a bit of an architecture stage, but we hope maybe we can have the K3V folks come in and give us an update maybe in one of the coming meetings. So these are sort of the main activities of work. Some folks are kind of taking a little bit of a lead, but really these are again open to all of us. So we should have more updates on that in the coming weeks. So I just wanted to kind of give a brief update to those who may not be familiar as to where are the areas of focus and what's kind of happening on some of these main threads. So that's all I have for now. We'll have more on these in coming meetings. Back to you, Tasha.
Cool. Does anyone have any quick questions about that? Okay, awesome. Adrian, do you want to briefly talk about your call for multi-tenancy use cases?
Sure. So we've got a doc somewhere. I was actually just looking for it. I can't find it right now. Tasha, you have it somewhere, like a list of use cases of like things that people want to do with tenancy. But when I was reading that, I was having a little bit of a hard time sort of mapping that to what it means in any kind of concrete way. And so what I decided to do is I started going back over old meeting notes. I only joined the group 2 weeks ago. Old meeting notes, looked at some videos from past conferences, just to get a sense of really concrete stories that users have been trying to go through with multi-tenancy. What kind of problems are they running into? Is it problems with managing the complexity of configuration? Is it problems with security, workload, isolation, stuff like that? Because there's a whole wide range of things that people want. So rather than trying to generalize, I was really trying to get as specific as possible, associate each story with the name of a customer or a user, and maybe a very rough categorization between sort of DevOps teams on one side and sort of SaaSes on another side. Those seem to be the two main kinds of tenants. So I've started a doc at the last meeting. I just dumped it into the end of the tenancy v2 doc, and I've just gone and taken that out, put it into a new doc, and I've added a link to the meeting notes, and I'll also add that to the Slack. And so my request to everybody who is on the call is, if you have an interesting use case with regards to tenancy that you don't already see there on the doc, can you just add it? Just make it as concrete as you can. Say, we've got 5 groups of about 10 people each or something like that. They each use 2 namespaces. As much detail as you feel comfortable sharing, or if you see somebody else that has something very similar to you, you can just add something and say, yeah, me too. This is also the kind of problem that I have that would be solved. So again, I'll send that out on the Slack channel after this meeting. And yeah, this is just a request for everybody to chime in and add what they can. That's all for me.
Cool, thanks. So other than that, the last update that we have today is we have been invited to go to the financial services user group and present our secure profiles. So as you all may remember, one of the initial pieces of work that we said that we were going to tackle as part of this working group was to write secure profiles for both a multi-tenant cluster, but initially also for a single user cluster, with the idea being that if we as a community can formalize around what does it mean to have a secure single tenant cluster, then we can go from there to say what does it mean to have a secure multi-tenant cluster. And so we do have rough drafts of both of those in our repo, and I would like to encourage everyone to take a look and kind of give your feedback. I do have some feedback I need to incorporate into the single tenant profile, but both profiles are definitely up for review. Both of them are incomplete, so I wanted to encourage everyone to take a look. What will be cool is once we have agreement upon best practices for both single and multi-tenant clusters, then we can start taking this to other working groups and SIGs and getting their feedback on it, and then trying to, as a community, agree that if you configure your cluster in this way, then we agree that this is a secure secure cluster using just Kubernetes as it is today without needing to, without things like going in and rebuilding the API or anything. So once we have that, then we can start talking about things like building CRDs and automation that would then, you could then install on a cluster and see, is my cluster currently configured to be secure? And it also opens up opportunities for us to do things like work with the conformance team to add a conformance suite that would be for a secure cluster, both single and multi-tenant. So yeah, that's up for grabs. Links are in our agenda doc, which you can always get to. If you can't find it, the link is included in our regular meeting notice as well. Cool. So I think that's it. Did anyone have anything else they wanted to add before the end today?
I had a sort of novice question, Natasha. It's Daniel. It's my first meeting I joined. What would be the best way to ramp up on the subject which I'm very interested in, and sort of make a connection of material that Jim presented about policies to multi-tenants? What sort of like ramp up path you recommend?
Yeah, so if you go to our repo on GitHub, there is a repo called Kubernetes-SIGs/multi-tenancy, and in there's a folder called docs, and within docs we include a bunch of links to important docs that as a group we have assembled over time. So I think that's a pretty good place to start.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Will do. And the connection of the policy will be covered at some point. I just been trying to understand, the logical link between the two.
Oh yeah, I got you. So some of that is some of the CRDs that we have been talking about is the idea of having a namespace CRD and a tenancy CRD, and so how would you automate the creation of these objects as you are creating them? And so policy becomes a very useful thing to be able to attach to namespaces as you're creating them in order to configure them to be multi-tenant.
Got it. Yeah. Customer service definition. Okay, thank you.
You can also look at the video, the session we did, the introductory and the deep dive session at KubeCon Barcelona. Both slides and video recording might help.
Okay, you guys have it posted in the group as well?
Yeah, all of our videos are on YouTube under the multi-tenancy YouTube list. So if you basically click on any of the videos linked to in the agenda, that'll take you to a whole list of videos that you can check out.
I also want to second
Great, thank you.
Yeah, sorry. I want to second Adrian's call for continuing to have more use cases. In particular, one key point that I feel like we still need a little bit more consensus on is some fundamental assumptions we are making in the current tenant controller designs. For example, is it vital for a tenant to include multiple namespaces? That is a key factor that I would like to have us agree on, because that influences a lot of the implementations of all of these things, right? If a tenant is always one namespace, that's a whole different thing than a tenant that has multiple namespaces. So just to second Adrian's call for use cases, if in particular you could mention your need for a tenant to cover multiple namespaces, as well as a few other topics, I think that'll be great, because we don't want to be making assumptions and have these be changed down the road.
Cool, sounds good. Okay, thanks everybody. Chat soon.
Thank you.